The words landed like a slap without a sound. "Stay quiet, you don't belong at this table." He didn't shout, he didn't even raise his voice. He leaned toward me with a smile on his face, the kind of smile that's practiced, polished, designed to look casual to everyone else, and said it like it was nothing, like it cost him nothing. Around us, crystal stemware caught the chandelier light and scattered it across white tablecloths. Somewhere nearby, a jazz pianist was working through a soft arrangement. Waitstaff moved between tables like shadows. The room smelled like expensive flowers and even more expensive cologne. A few people at our table gave the kind of small, uncomfortable laughter that people offer when they don't know what else to do. Others suddenly discovered something fascinating on their dinner plates. I felt the heat climb my neck, settle into my face, and burn there. And then the man 3 seats to my left put down his fork. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, then at my husband, then back at me. His eyes narrowed, not with hostility, but with recognition, the way someone looks when they're trying to place a face they've seen somewhere before. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out his phone, and began scrolling. For a few seconds, the only sounds were the music and the murmur of the room. Then he went completely still. "Oh my goodness," he whispered. The table quieted. He turned the phone screen toward me, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. I knew exactly where that photograph had been taken. I knew because I remembered the smell before I remembered anything else. Wet lumber, torn insulation. That particular mix of mud and destruction and diesel exhaust that becomes the signature scent of disaster. I remembered the weight of exhaustion in my legs and the feeling that I'd been awake for 2 straight days because I had been. The photo was taken in Kansas. 7 months earlier, I was standing in front of what remained of a community center after a tornado had removed the better part of its roof. My jacket was crusted with dried mud. My hair was tied back with a rubber band someone had found on the ground. I had dark circles under my eyes that no filter in the world could have touched. I was not a flattering photograph, which made the man's reaction even harder to understand. He was staring at me like he'd just found something he'd been searching for. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "is this you?" I looked at him, I looked at the screen, I said, "Yes, that's me." And for the next hour, everything my husband had spent years building began to quietly come apart. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the context. My name is Caroline Stratton. I'm 43 years old. I spent 13 years in the United States Army working in logistics and operational coordination before I left the service and redirected everything I had learned into something I loved more than I expected to: nonprofit housing work. For the past 6 years, I've run a veterans housing organization that provides emergency shelter placement, transitional housing support, and long-term stability services to veterans, military-connected families, and elderly residents who are at risk of homelessness. We work across several counties. We partner with churches, hospitals, county agencies, private donors, and anyone else willing to show up and help. It's not glamorous work. There are no galas held in our honor. Nobody writes glossy magazine profiles about us. Most of what I do involves paperwork, phone calls, bureaucratic battles, funding negotiations, and problem-solving in situations where the people who need help the most are the least able to advocate for themselves. I love it without reservation, without apology. My husband, Marcus, works in commercial real estate development. He's been doing it for 15 years and he's very good at it. He knows how to read a room, read a deal, read a person. He's charming in that specific, practiced way that people in his industry tend to be. He talks about leverage and positioning the way other people talk about the weather. Somewhere in the last few years, he started talking about me the same way. The evening I'm describing took place in early November at a private venue attached to a historic hotel outside the city. The event was a charity fundraiser, the kind where tables cost several $1,000s and the guest list reads like the business section of a regional newspaper: retired executives, foundation directors, political figures, military brass. The kind of people who carry influence the way the rest of us carry our phones. Always present, mostly invisible, suddenly very loud when you need it to matter. I had not wanted to go. My right knee had been aching all week from an old service injury that acts up whenever the temperature drops, and I haven't been careful enough. I'd also spent the previous 4 days managing a housing crisis involving a 78-year-old Korean War veteran whose building had been sold to a development company with almost no notice to tenants. I was running on 4 hours of sleep, and the kind of tired that coffee doesn't really touch. But Marcus had been insistent. "We need to be there," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the bathroom mirror. "These are important people. Not I want to spend the evening with you, not it'll be good to get out of the house. We need to be there." Like I was a strategic asset he needed to deploy. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I do that. I have a habit of giving people the benefit of the doubt, long past the point where it's doing either of us any good. We arrived at the venue a little after 7. The room was beautiful in the way expensive rooms always are: intentional, curated, designed to make people feel like they've arrived somewhere that matters. I smoothed my dress, touched Marcus's arm, and followed him toward our assigned table. Within 10 minutes, I understood why we were there. Marcus worked the table with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, which he had. Handshakes, business card exchanges, the careful architecture of first impressions. He introduced me to each person we met with a particular kind of efficiency that I had stopped finding flattering. "This is my wife, Caroline. She was in the army." Past tense. Was, as though my service were something that had expired, like a gym membership. These days she volunteers with a local veterans group. Volunteers. Not runs, not leads, not has built from the ground up. Volunteers, like I was helping at a bake sale. I smiled at each new face and said nothing, because that was the arrangement, though I couldn't have articulated it to you in that moment. The arrangement had never been discussed out loud. It had simply accumulated, over years, one small edit at a time. Dinner was served. Conversation shifted through the usual topics: sports, politics, real estate, philanthropy. A retired Air Force general at our table mentioned the growing challenge of housing for older veterans. I leaned forward slightly, because this was genuinely my territory. "In our county alone," I started, "we've seen a 40% increase in veterans over 65 who are facing." Marcus laughed. It was a light laugh, conversational, perfectly calibrated for the table. He put his hand on my arm. "Caroline is very passionate," he said, smiling around the table. "But let's let the big picture thinkers handle the strategy side, right, honey?" 2 people chuckled. Someone reached for the breadbasket. I looked at Marcus. He gave me the look he gave me when he thought I was about to make things awkward, warm on the surface, warning underneath. I looked down at my plate. The conversation moved on. 20 minutes later, a woman across the table asked me a direct question about county housing partnerships and whether local nonprofits were struggling with rising costs. I began answering, carefully and specifically, because I knew the answer down to the dollar amounts. That's when Marcus leaned close, his voice low, his smile still in place for anyone watching. "Caroline," he said, "stay quiet, you don't understand who's at this table." He said it gently, almost kindly, like he was doing me a favor. I heard a fork touch a plate somewhere very far away. I felt something in my chest go very still, not numb but quiet, the way things go quiet right before they shift. That's when the man 3 seats away put down his silverware. His name was Edmund Hartley. 71 years old, though he carried himself younger. Texas oil family money that had been redirected, over the last 2 decades, almost entirely into philanthropic work. He ran a foundation that funded disaster relief housing, veteran transition programs, and rural community infrastructure across 11 states. When Edmund Hartley paid attention to something, institutions listened. He had paid attention to me. And what came next took about 45 seconds to change the entire trajectory of the evening. After I confirmed that the photograph was me, Edmund looked at me with an expression I'm still not sure how to fully describe. Quiet, almost relieved. "That photograph," he said, "was included in an operational report our foundation reviewed earlier this year. a disaster housing response in the Midwest. I nodded slowly. I was there for about 12 days. He looked at the others at the table. We fund emergency housing and recovery projects nationally. When we review operations, we look at outcomes, coordination, resource allocation, community partnerships. He turned back to me. Every road in that report led back to one name. Marcus shifted beside me. He laughed, a little too quickly. Caroline's always been modest about her involvement. She works with a small nonprofit, mostly volunteer-driven. Edmund paused, just briefly, his eyes moved from Marcus to me. Is that how you describe it? I felt the eyes of the table. I felt Marcus's hand tight, almost imperceptibly, around his water glass. No, I said, and I surprised myself with how steady my voice was. That's not how I describe it. The table went quiet. Edmund leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the Meadowfield relocation project. I blinked. The fact that he knew that name told me more than anything he could have said directly. 62 residents, I said, displaced when their building was condemned. We had 10 days. How did you house all 62? We didn't, not all at once. We triaged by need. Medical cases first. We had 6 residents with oxygen equipment and 2 with dialysis requirements, so we secured those placements within 48 hours through a partnership with a regional medical transportation nonprofit. The rest we moved through a rotating system using 3 churches and a converted community space. Edmund nodded, his expression hadn't changed. What about cost? Most of the placements were subsidized through emergency county funds we'd already built relationships with. We covered the gap through donor connections we'd cultivated over 3 years. And the transportation. Veterans helping veterans. We have a volunteer driver network, mostly retired service members. They showed up. Edmund sat back slowly. Marcus cleared his throat. This is all really impressive, though I think what Edmund is probably more interested in is the larger strategic framework our firm has been. Actually, Edmund said, and the single word was enough, I'd like to hear more from Caroline. The table was quiet in a different way now. Not uncomfortable, attentive. I talked for the next 15 minutes. Not about accomplishments, not about accolades, because those things aren't what make the work real. I talked about people. About a 90-year-old widow named Agnes who had lived in the same apartment for 34 years and wept when she thought she'd never see her neighborhood again, and how a volunteer named Robert, a Vietnam-era Marine with a bad hip, spent 2 days helping her pack and then personally drove her to her new place and sat with her until she stopped shaking. I talked about a 39-year-old veteran named Daniel who had been sleeping in a storage unit because he was too proud to call anyone, and how we found him because his neighbor reported a concern, and how he cried when we told him we had a place for him that same night. I talked about the church ladies in the Midwest who appeared, seemingly out of thin air, with enough food to feed everyone involved in the relief operation for 3 days straight. By the time I finished, nobody at the table was looking at their phone. The woman next to Edmund, silver-haired, quiet, watching me with calm, assessing eyes, had barely moved during any of it. She was his wife, Miriam Hartley. When I stopped talking, she reached for her water glass, took a small sip, and then said something that hit me harder than anything else that evening had. I want to ask you something. Of course. She tilted her head slightly. Why has Marcus never mentioned any of this? The table went completely silent. Marcus's smile didn't disappear. It hardened. There's a difference, and everyone at the table understood it. I looked down at my hands, then I looked back at Miriam. I suppose, I said carefully, it never seemed important to him. She nodded, slowly, the nod of a woman who has lived long enough to understand everything that lives in the space between a sentence and the truth. Edmund placed his phone flat on the table. I find that surprising, he said, looking directly at Marcus. Not unkindly, not accusingly, with the calm, steady honesty of someone who has no reason to be anything other than direct. Because Caroline's organization is one of the primary reasons our foundation became interested in housing partnerships in this region. The air changed. I watched something happen on Marcus's face. Not a collapse, not a scene, but a crack. The kind of fracture that happens when a man who has carefully controlled a narrative discovers the narrative has been moving without him. Edmund's foundation. The one Marcus had been courting for 8 months. The one he'd told me twice was almost certainly going to come through. The one that had partially driven his decision to attend this particular event, at this particular table, on this particular evening. And his connection to it had never been Marcus. It had been me. Around us, conversations restarted, but our table had changed. The questions that followed were directed at me. The interest that had been distributed politely around the table had reorganized itself. People were leaning forward when I spoke instead of looking politely elsewhere. Marcus said very little for the next 20 minutes. I should have felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt something quieter and sadder than that. Because listening to strangers show genuine curiosity about work my husband had spent years minimizing, I started to hear something I had been ignoring for too long. Not a single comment. Not one bad evening. A pattern. A sustained, deliberate pattern. And patterns, once you see them clearly, are very hard to unsee. There's a woman I know named Beverly, mid-60s, sharp as anyone I've ever met, built 3 successful businesses before she was 50, uses a cane now because of her knee. She pulled me aside during dessert and said without any preamble, "My son-in-law talks over me like I'm furniture that wandered in from another room." She said it with a wry smile, but her eyes were serious. I'm telling you because I recognized the look. I didn't ask which look she meant. I knew. The look of a woman who has been politely, persistently, and systematically made smaller by someone who was supposed to love her. She touched my arm as she left. Don't let it go on too long, sweetheart. It has a way of becoming permanent if you do. A few minutes after that, a woman from Edmund's foundation staff mentioned, in passing, that Marcus had been very enthusiastic about the advisory board position being assembled for the foundation's new housing initiative. I turned toward her. She blinked. Oh, I assumed you knew. I looked at Marcus. He adjusted his cufflink. I have known this man for 11 years. I know every tell he has. And suddenly, the entire evening organized itself into a shape I could see clearly. The expensive new suit. The coaching in the car on the way over let me lead the conversation. Don't get too detailed, just smile and let the evening flow. The way he'd introduced me at every table as window dressing for a story in which he was the protagonist. He hadn't brought me as his wife. He had brought me as his credential, his connection to veterans' housing, his evidence of caring, his entry point to a foundation board that could reshape his professional trajectory. And the only thing standing between him and that objective was whether I stayed small enough for him to stand in front of. I sat there with my coffee going cold. Something settled in me, not anger, not grief, not even resolution. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives, sometimes, after a very long time of seeing something in peripheral vision and not quite turning to look at it directly. I turned to look at it directly. I stepped out of the ballroom for a few minutes. The corridor was quieter, carpeted, soft-lit, lined with framed photographs of local landscapes. I leaned against the wall and rubbed my knee. Edmund and Miriam followed me out. We stood there for a moment without anyone saying anything. Then Miriam pointed at my leg. Old injury. Service, I said, axe up in the cold. She shook her head. These floors are criminal. I wore the wrong shoes and I've been paying for it since the salad course. I laughed, a real laugh, the involuntary kind. Edmund smiled. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. Caroline, I owe you an apology. I looked at him. For what? I should have made the connection sooner. He shook his head slightly. We've been reviewing housing proposals for several months. Every time I looked at the Veterans Housing Initiative, your name was everywhere. County contacts, volunteer records, partnership agreements, community relationships, infrastructure. He looked at me steadily. Every line of evidence pointed to you. Every road went through you. I didn't know what to say to that. When you're inside the work every day, you stop seeing your own fingerprints. You're only ever looking at the next problem. But the presentations we received, Edmund continued, told a very different story. I looked at the floor. Marcus never made false statements, Edmund said. He talked about strategy, connections, vision, growth frameworks, all genuine things. He paused. But the picture those presentations painted of who built what that was considerably rearranged. I nodded slowly, because I had suspected this without letting myself know it. Miriam stood quietly beside him, and then she said, I don't think Marcus understands what you've built. My throat tightened. Our board, Edmund said, with the smallest trace of humor, initially assumed Marcus was your spouse. I stared at him. The supportive partner, Miriam added, and something in her voice was warm. The one in the background helping make everything possible. I laughed before I could stop myself, a real, helpless, entirely genuine laugh, and Edmund and Miriam both laughed with me. For a few seconds, standing in a hotel corridor with two people I'd known for less than an hour, I laughed until my eyes watered. It felt extraordinary, not because anything was resolved, because for one moment, I saw myself through the eyes of people who had looked only at the work, only at the results, only at the facts. And those Plea had come to a completely different conclusion about who mattered. When the laughter faded, something heavier settled in. Edmund seemed to see it. Are you all right? I hesitated for a moment. No, I said, not really. It felt good to say something true. Miriam nodded. She didn't offer platitudes. That was generous of her. I looked at the hallway window. The city spread out in the distance, lights scattered across the dark like scattered embers. I've spent a long time, I said slowly, making excuses for the pattern. He's ambitious, he's under pressure, he doesn't mean it the way it sounds. I paused. But he does mean it the way it sounds. I think I've known that for a while. Neither of them interrupted. I think I've spent so much time helping other people find the courage to stand up that I forgot I was allowed to stand up too. Edmund looked at me for a moment. There's something else I want to ask you. I straightened. We'd like you to speak to the room before the formal program begins. I shook my head before he finished the sentence. No, absolutely not. He smiled. That was fast. I hate talking about myself in public. I'd rather sort through tornado debris. Miriam tilted her head. You wouldn't be talking about yourself, you'd be talking about the work. My hands are shaking already just thinking about it. Good, she said simply. I stared at her. It means you care about it, she said. The people who shouldn't be trusted with a microphone are the ones whose hands never shake. I looked toward the ballroom doors. Through them, I could feel the weight of the room, the conversations, the influence, the money, the history. And somewhere in the middle of it, Marcus, sitting with his practiced smile, managing whatever remained of his version of this evening. Then the doors opened, and Marcus stepped into the hallway. He saw us, he stopped. His expression shifted, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough. The warning expression, the one I'd been responding to for years. The one that said don't, please don't, not here, not now, just let it go. Edmund looked at me. Miriam looked at me. I thought about Agnes, who wept in her apartment and needed someone to stay until she stopped shaking. I thought about Daniel, sleeping in a storage unit because he couldn't bring himself to ask. I thought about every person I'd ever helped find their footing after someone or something had taken it from them. And I thought about the fact that I had not, in 11 years of marriage, allowed myself the same thing I'd spent my professional life fighting to give other people. The right to take up the full amount of space I deserved. I looked at Marcus. Then I looked at Edmund. Okay, I said, I'll speak. For the first time all evening, I watched something that looked like genuine fear move across my husband's face. The walk back into that room felt like walking across a different landscape than the one I'd entered 3 hours earlier. I wasn't walking in as an accessory to someone else's story. I was walking in as myself. Edmund did not make a production of it. That wasn't his style. He moved to the front of the room, waited for conversation to settle, and when it did, He simply said that before the formal program began, he wanted to introduce someone whose work had been shaping the region's housing landscape in ways that most people in the room hadn't fully understood. The room was attentive, expectant. I walked to the front, my knee ached, my hands were cold, the microphone felt absurdly formal. I looked out at the room. Retired generals, business leaders, philanthropists, foundation board members, people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, people who had lived enough of life to know the difference between performance and honesty. I took a breath. "My name is Caroline Stratton," I said. I paused. "I'm going to be honest with you. I'm much more comfortable doing this work than talking about it. So I'm going to skip talking about myself entirely and just tell you about some of the people I've had the privilege of working with." A few people smiled. Something in the room relaxed, including me. I talked about Thomas, 81 years old, World War II-era family, Korean War veteran, lived alone in a building slated for sudden demolition. The man had 3 Purple Hearts and no family nearby, and didn't call anyone because he believed asking for help was a form of failure. We found him because his mail carrier noticed the stack of unopened notices at his door and called the county. We got him placed in 48 hours. He told the volunteer who helped him move that it was the first time anyone had taken care of him since his wife died 17 years earlier. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when they're listening. I talked about Loretta, a military widow who had spent 4 decades raising children and moving every 2 years, and putting her husband's career ahead of everything else, and who found herself at 72 in a city she didn't know, with a fixed income that couldn't keep pace with rising rents, and no idea how to ask for help, because she'd spent her entire life being the person other people leaned on. I watched several women in the audience look down. I talked about the tornado, about the volunteers who showed up with tools before anyone asked, about the churches that materialized food from somewhere when there wasn't supposed to be any food, about the National Guard members who worked through a cold rainstorm for 12 straight hours because that's what they did, about the retired mechanic who fixed a wheelchair ramp for free because the resident who needed it reminded him of his father. I said something I hadn't planned to say. Most people who need help don't need it because something is wrong with them. The room was very still. They need it because life arrived from 3 directions at once: a medical event, a housing crisis, a death, a job loss, a storm. 2 of those things overlap, and the third one finishes the job. And suddenly someone who has spent an entire lifetime being capable, independent, and proud is sleeping in a car or on a friend's couch, and the shame of that is sometimes the hardest thing to fix. Nobody was looking anywhere other than straight ahead. "The good news," I said, and I felt the shift in the room, "is that ordinary Americans are still remarkable. I have seen retired plumbers drive 2 hours to fix a roof for free. I have seen church congregations organize entire neighborhoods. I have seen veterans with almost nothing show up to help someone who had a little less." The room shifted from quiet to warm. I stepped back from the microphone. The applause wasn't explosive. It was the kind that means something steady, sustained, genuine. Several people stood, not many, enough. I found my seat. Edmund stepped forward and waited for the room to settle. "Thank you, Caroline," he said. Then he looked across the room with the calm authority of someone who has been in enough rooms to know exactly what he wants to say when he's in one. "I want everyone here to know that the Hartley Foundation intends to pursue the Veterans Housing Initiative in this region in direct partnership with Caroline Stratton's organization." Silence, pure silence. Then a second wave of applause, longer and louder than the first. I glanced at Marcus. His face was completely composed, the kind of composed that takes a great deal of effort to maintain. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed at a point slightly above the table. Across the room, several Foundation staff members were already in conversation, not with Marcus, not anyone he knew. The board position he had quietly expected to materialize had just as quietly ceased to exist. A few minutes later, Marcus stood. He raised his glass. He smiled, and credit to him, it was a good smile even then. Caroline and I have always functioned as a team, he said, looking at the room. Everything she's built with that foundation behind her. People looked at me. The old instinct rose up immediately. Nod, smile, let it go, keep the peace, protect him. I let the instinct pass through me, without acting on it. I stood up. I looked at Marcus. Then I looked at the room. Marcus has been a part of my life for a long time, I said, and I kept my voice level because this wasn't about anger. But I want to be honest with everyone here tonight about something that I think matters. I paused. There is a difference between being supported and being managed. And I think it's important, especially in this room, with so much influence and so many resources, to understand that difference clearly. Because the people we're trying to help deserve organizations, led by people who know the distinction from both directions. Nobody moved. The work I described tonight is not a team effort in the way that word was just used. The work belongs to the volunteers, the donors, the community partners, and the families who had the courage to ask for help, not to either of us personally. I sat down. Miriam started clapping first, then Edmund, then the general with the white eyebrows, then, gradually, the room. Marcus sat down slowly. He didn't look at me. His phone lit up on the table. The screen faced upward. Neither of us had arranged it that way. Life simply does these things sometimes. The preview showed a message from his business partner. Call me first thing Monday. We need to discuss the Hartley situation. The man sitting next to him, older, silver-haired, navy blazer, glanced at the screen without meaning to, then looked very carefully in the other direction. I pressed my lips together and looked at my coffee. The drive home was 40 minutes of silence. The city moved past the windows, streetlights, late traffic, the dark outline of the landscape beyond. Marcus broke the silence when we were about 10 minutes from home. You embarrassed me. I turned to look at him. That's what you're thinking about, I said. You made me look. I told the truth, Marcus. He was quiet for a moment. You made it seem like I've been using you. I looked out the window. Haven't you? He didn't answer. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When we got home, I slept in the guest room. I slept better than I had in months. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Dramatic endings are for movies. Real endings are mostly administrative, quiet, gradual, and far more exhausting than any single confrontation. Marcus, to his credit, tried. He brought coffee to the guest room one evening in December. He sat down and said the words I had been waiting for. I'm sorry. And then, I'm sorry you felt hurt. I looked at the coffee mug in my hands. There's a difference, I said quietly, between being sorry something happened and being sorry for what you did. He stared at me. You're not sorry for the pattern, Marcus. You're sorry the pattern became visible. His shoulders sagged. I was trying to build something. You were building it on top of me. That sentence went into the air between us and stayed there. He didn't have an answer. And in that absence, I finally understood clearly something I had been circling for years. The man across from me had never fully understood the difference between support and subtraction. He had never grasped that making someone smaller isn't the same as lifting yourself up. He likely never would, not because he was incapable of growth, but because he had never once accepted that he needed it. I stopped arguing, not because I had given up. Because there was nothing left to argue about. The next 3 months involved a counselor, then an attorney, then another counselor, then a great deal of walking through my neighborhood in the early morning while everything was still quiet. Starting over at 43 wasn't something I had ever imagined preparing for. Some evenings I felt clear and purposeful. Other evenings I cried in my car after work, and then felt embarrassed about it. And then reminded myself that feeling embarrassed about grief was just grief adding an extra layer of weight I didn't need. Healing doesn't follow a schedule. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or selling you something. The question I eventually stopped asking was whether leaving makes me someone who didn't try hard enough. The question I started asking, instead, was whether staying would require me to abandon myself. That question was easier to answer. The Veterans Housing and Community Center opened on a bright morning in late April. Nothing about it was fancy, and I loved it for that. There were folding chairs and long tables, and a coffee station that was slightly undersupplied from the start, and a bulletin board full of resource listings, and a small medical consultation room, and a transportation coordination office, and a meeting space that smelled like new carpet and old wood. People showed up. Not in enormous numbers, but they were real people with real needs and real stories, and they found their way through the door, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. I watched an 80-year-old woman sit down with a volunteer and start figuring out her transportation plan. I watched two veterans in their 70s argue about baseball with the comfortable hostility of people who have found somewhere they belong. I watched a retired auto mechanic offer to fix another resident's walker because he'd noticed it was bent and it bothered him. Someone complained about the coffee. Someone else complained about the chairs. I loved all of it. People only complain when they feel safe enough to stay. Edmund and Miriam attended the opening. So did a county commissioner, 3 foundation representatives, and somewhere around 150 volunteers, donors, and community members who had been part of making the thing real. Edmund found me in the lobby afterward and handed me a cup of coffee. "Quite a morning," he said. "It is," I said. He looked around the room. "You should feel proud." A year earlier I would have deflected, redirected credit, minimized my own role. The old habit runs deep. Instead, I simply nodded. "I do," I said. He smiled. "Good." Standing in that lobby, watching people move through a space that hadn't existed a year ago, watching them find help and find each other, and find community in the way that people do when someone has thought carefully about what they actually need, I understood something I want to say as clearly as I can. The most meaningful moment of this story is not the one in the ballroom. It's not the moment Marcus's networking strategy fell apart in front of everyone who mattered to him professionally. It's not the applause. It's not the look on his face when he realized the narrative had moved without him. Those things happened, and I would be less than honest if I told you they didn't matter to some tired, tight part of me. But the most meaningful moment was earlier. In the hotel corridor, with Miriam and Edmund, when I said no, not really instead of the smile I would have given before. That was the moment. Because for 11 years, I had been an expert at helping other people reclaim their voice, their dignity, their right to take up space in the world. I had sat across from veterans who felt they had no right to ask for help, and I had said, gently and firmly, "You earned this, you matter, let someone help you." I had sat with widows who felt invisible and said, "You are not invisible." I had sat with elderly strangers who had spent their whole lives being capable and strong, and I had said, "Needing help doesn't erase what you've built." And I had not once said any of those things to myself. Your value is not something another person assigns. It is not something that requires the recognition of whoever happens to be standing closest to you. It is not contingent on being introduced correctly at dinner parties, or described with the right words, or positioned favorably in someone else's professional narrative. It simply is. The hardest work I have ever done, harder than any disaster response, any housing crisis, any bureaucratic battle, was learning to extend to myself the same basic belief I had always extended to everyone else. That I was worth fighting for. Not because of what I'd accomplished, not because Edmund Hartley knew my name, not because of the applause in a ballroom in November. Because I'm a person, and that was always enough. If you're listening to this today, and somewhere in my story you recognized something from your own life, a pattern, a voice, a persistent small diminishment that you've been explaining away for longer than you should have, I want you to hear this directly. It's not too late, it was never too late. The voice that was taken from you, or slowly edited away, or made to feel too small for the room you were standing in, that voice is still yours. It has always been yours. No one can own it. No one can permanently remove it. they can only convince you for a time that it doesn't belong to you. It does. Use it. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope wherever you are, whatever you're navigating, you know that someone, even a stranger with a story, is rooting for you to stand up and take your full amount of space. You've earned it. The Veterans Housing and Community Center serves over 200 individuals annually and continues to expand its programs in partnership with county agencies, faith organizations, and private donors. If you found value in this story, please share it with someone who might need it today.